DaVinci Resolve is known for being one of the premier color correction and color grading softwares on the market when it comes to video editing, hands down. That also means that it's going to be one of the trickiest ones to learn because it has so many features. So today I want to walk you through the color page on a very basic intro level so that you can really start understanding what's going on in there, understanding the way that DaVinci Resolve looks at color and looks at light. And you'll be able to actually make sense of all these crazy knobs and dials and color wheels so that when you start learning some of the more advanced features, you'll have a great reference point. Let's dive right in. So here we are looking at the DaVinci Resolve color page. And in the upper left, you can see the clip that I'm looking at. The middle section here is just the preview window. Over to the right is the nodes and some of the effects you can use, but we're not even going to touch those today. What I want to focus on is the timeline itself, and then some of the color wheels in the lower left and the scopes in the lower right. The reason I want to start here is I really feel that if you start to understand how these work, then all the other advanced features that people like to dive into way too quickly for my personal preference start to make a lot more sense because you understand the foundation first. So let's take a look at what we have here. Now I've got one main clip here in my timeline. Now, the reason I can see that is in the upper left, you can see that I have clips selected. If I had that off, you wouldn't be able to see it. So if you don't see it on your end, make sure you have clips turned on. Now, you might have many clips. I only have one because if I go back to the edit page, you'll see that in my project, there's only one clip that I'm working with. Now, if I had split this clip into two and I had two sections, if I go back to that color page, you'll now see that I have two clips. See, so just understand that when we're looking at clips, it just means how many different separate assets you might have in your timeline. Some of those might be images, video files, anything that you could potentially color correct. So let's just start right here with the one clip that I've split in half and we're looking at is two clips. Now, when you select that in that clip section of the timeline here, I'm calling it the timeline, but technically in the upper right, there is a timeline option that you can click that will actually show you the clips as they appear in your timeline. Here's the first clip. Here's the second clip. There's a space in between because in the main timeline on the edit page, I've got them separated. If I had them right close together and went back to the color page, well, then these two are right next to each other. So just understand that the actual blue line is the true timeline, and the section above that is just the clip section, which is still somewhat true to the timeline of the clips as they occur throughout your project. I'm going to turn the timeline off. I think it bugs me a bit. It gets in my way. I just like looking at the clips. Now, if I select one of these clips by left clicking on it, you'll see that it's highlighted in red. And then I can move that timeline scroller underneath the clip up above in the preview window to go anywhere I want within that particular clip that I have selected. Now, down in the lower left, you will see that there are a bunch of interesting looking color wheels with a lot of things going on around it. There's actually three different wheels here, and depending on how you might have DaVinci Resolve set, you might see a different one pop up first. Now, the first color wheel, if you go down here and you'll see you can select the different three. The first one is called the primaries color wheel. Now this is broken up by lift, gamma, and gain, and offset. Hold that thought. The second option is the primaries color bars. What you're going to find out is this is virtually identical to the previous color wheels one we just looked at, but it's using bars instead of a wheel where you move the center mouse pointer around. You can actually use individual bars on this one. And then the third one you'll see is log wheels. Now it looks a lot like the original color wheels that we saw, but it's actually very different. And I want to explain the differences between those three that I really feel is the foundation of understanding how to color grade or color correct using DaVinci Resolve. I should probably make that distinction right off the bat. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about color grading and color correcting. In a very loose way, when people talk about color correcting, what they mean is that your camera itself may either add a certain amount of color or presets to get your footage to look a certain way in camera, or sometimes you might even be filming in what they call RAW, which is where you ask your camera not to add really anything in terms of contrast, brightness, color exposure, tints, any of those things. So when you're color correcting, what you're really thinking about is taking the footage into your project and correcting for anything that might be a little off, trying to get the white balance where you want it and start from a neutral standpoint. Color grading tends to be more about creating an atmosphere where you might intentionally be moving the color one way or another to create a mood. Like if you're trying to create a scene that looks more like it's at night, things might be more blue, or if you're in a set that has a lot of red lighting going on, of course the thing is going to feel more red because that's how the scene was lit. So color grading is more about mood, color correction is more about trying to get that neutral starting point. Two different terms that I think sometimes get confused, and I wanted to mention them. So let's think about this in terms of color correcting and trying to get things a little more neutral. I have a piece of footage here that I filmed with my friend Bam the drummer. And you can see that we filmed it in one of my production rooms, and the room itself tends to be a little red. Now, what I want to do is show you the scopes on the right to help understand what it is we're looking at from a color perspective. Now, if you look at the scene, maybe you'll see it, maybe it looks different on your monitor, but on my monitors that are fairly well calibrated, it seems it's a little more red. That's just the lighting in that room. There's a lot of red tones in there. And it's like a little bit dark. I don't know if you can see that, but does it feel like the footage is a little bit dark? This is one of the things that if you look at the scopes and you know what you're looking at, you can easily see how that's reflected in the scopes themselves. Let me start here with what they call the parade scope. It's the scope I use the most. If you were to go above this window and hit the drop down, you'll see there's different types of scopes that you can pull up. But Parade is the default one I like to use. I think it really helps you understand the color of your clip, even if your monitors may not be perfectly calibrated. Looking at this Parade scope, everything on that left side, you see at the bottom it says 0, and at the top it goes up to 1023. I won't go deep into the explanation of why those numbers are there, but what I want you to think about is down at 0, think about that as the blackest of blacks, like light being completely turned off and you can't see anything. Pitch dark night. And then think of that 1023 as a really, really bright area, what your eyes can pick up as a lot of light. So that left is really thinking about dark and then thinking about all the way up to the lightest things that your eye can really pick up and see. Now across it from left to right, you'll see there's bands of red that harshly change to then green, and then another section that's harshly changed to blue. They're very separated and they feel very independent. The reason we see red, green, and blue is probably what you've heard before as RGB. Red, green, and blue are the primary colors that make up literally every other color available. So if you can see here, the red section seems to go a little taller. See how it spikes up a little higher? And then the green, which is to the right of that, doesn't spike up quite as high. And then the blue to the right of that is even squashed a bit more. So what you're really looking at here is the amount of color based on how much color is there in the lows, the midtones, and the highs based on the image of where I'm at in my timeline, where I have the playhead right now. If I were to move this playhead around and the scene changed at all, you would actually see these change a bit. This is a fairly consistent shot. If it was a shot where suddenly there was a bright light or he stepped out of the room and the lighting changed, you'd see it reflected in the scopes because it's constantly reading what's going on for the clip that I have selected. Now, to understand the scopes over here, this is where these two things are going to work together. You want to take your wheels and your scopes and see how they work together to either help you color grade or color correct your footage. Now, to understand this first set of primaries in the color wheels, okay, I've selected the very first set of wheels. Not these two, but this very first one. So click on that and you'll see primary color wheels. The first set of controls all the way to the left is called lift. And what that's going to do is control the amount of color in the lower end or darker portions of this entire clip. The next section over from the left is called gamma. And I want you to think of that as like the midtones, not the darkest, not the brightest, but all of that midtone that helps fill out your image. To the right of that, you're going to see gain, and that's all of your highs, your brightest colors. How much reds, greens, and blues are up in those really, really bright tones. And then the final wheel to the right is called offset, and that's almost like a master volume. So if we were to think about this thing like an old car stereo, you'd almost think of it like the lift is your bass, the gamma is your mids, your gain is your treble, and then the offset is sort of like the master volume, moving everything all together up and down. And if you've ever EQ'd a song in a car where you have to control the lows, the mids, and the highs to get the sound right, that's kind of what we're doing here, but we're doing it with color. All right, so let's take a quick look at how these wheels affect the color based on the scopes. And this is really important. I want you to watch what happens here. Now, this lift you can control a bunch of ways. There's a center dot that you can move around and change things around. I'll reset that. Here's a reset button. And I want to use just this wheel underneath. If you left click and hold, you can drag it down or up. Now, if I left click just on the lift and I pull it to the right, see what's happening in the scopes? That very bottom section, the darkest portions of this video clip are being elevated. And if you look at the clip up above, you can see it feels a lot less saturated. It feels like there's not a lot of color going on, almost as if all the bottom darks have been taken away. But I want you to watch how this moves when I do that. When I go up and down, can you see it's not just the bottom? It actually squishes up the mids and it brings it all the way up to the top. It's almost like you've got a fixed point at the top and it's moving everything, lows and mids, up together, starting with that low point that you're grabbing it and pulling everything up. Let me go over to the gamma section. This is more of the midtones, right? So looking at our scope, that mid should represent that center band. Now, if I do the same thing and grab that wheel underneath, left click and hold, and I move it upward, do you see that now the bottom really is kind of still staying fixed, but it's stretching the mids up. It's grabbing some of the lows and dragging them with it, but that fixed low point is there, the fixed high point is there, and it's almost like it's stretching the entire middle. That's what's happening here in the color wheels section of the primaries. And if you look up in your preview window, you can actually see those mids getting brighter or darker, that whole mid section. It's not getting super bright at the top, but the mids, it's lighting everything up, almost like there's a fill light that's starting to fill the room and bring more brightness to the ambience of the room, all those midtones. Let me reset that one more time and let me go over to the gain. Now, gain is really the very top. That's the brightest bright parts of your footage. And when I grab the slower wheel, left click and hold, and I drag it to the right, can you see how it's dragging the brightest portions up, even out of the scope? It's going above and beyond, stretching it to the point where there's actually frequencies your eye may not even be able to pick up. So it's stretching just the very top, but you can see as you stretch the top, it drags a little bit of the mids with it. This is something I want you to understand about this primaries color wheel. When we use lift, gamma, gain, low, mid, high, there's some wash that each will interact a little bit. It's almost like grabbing someone's shoulder and pulling them over. Whatever you grab and pull, it's going to bring other pieces that are connected along with it, and they'll move along with the thing that you're moving. Now, the offset, which is looking at the entire thing, it's like the master volume. If you watch what I do here, if I reset everything and then I left click and hold and drag the wheel just on the offset, watch what happens. The entire thing moves up and the entire thing moves down. That's taking all of the colors, the reds, the greens, and the blues that are in that visible light spectrum that we're seeing from 0 to 1023, and it's not stretching them. It's either bringing the entire thing up, and you can see what's happening in the preview window. Everything gets brighter evenly all the way up, or it brings everything down and everything gets darker evenly. The lows, the mids, the highs, everything moves at once. Almost like an elevator, and when it goes down, it brings everything down, the tops and the bottoms down with it. There's no stretching to that. It's not expanding the mids or expanding the highs. It's moving everything up and down in the visible light spectrum that your eye might see. Now, if I go over to the next section, which is the color bars, primaries color bars, you'll see the names are the same: lift, gamma, gain, offset. And those all do the same things too. If I start playing with them, if I left click and hold on that wheel on the lift, and I start turning it to the right, you'll see the very same thing happened that happened when I was back on the color wheel section. The only thing that's different between this section, the primary color wheels, and the primaries color bars, is the individual controls when you want to start breaking down just the reds in the darks or just the greens in the darks. When you individually start controlling the colors in each section, sometimes you might want to use the wheel that's a little more interactive, or you might want to go to the bars that really isolate just the red, just the green, just the blue. That's when I usually will switch over to the bars, because I can get a little more fine tuning where it's not affecting the other parts quite as much. It's really dialing into just the reds or just the greens or just the blues. Stay with me. I know some of this can be confusing and there's a lot of information, But I just want you to think about the light spectrum, dark to light, and then red, green, and blue. That's all we're playing with here with all of these scopes and all of these primary wheels and bars. Now, where it really gets different, let me reset this, is when I go to the third and final primaries, and that's the log wheels. This one, you'll physically be able to see the difference. Now, I know we said, remember, it looks so much like this one. Why do they give us two different things that look so much the same? It's the way they interact. DaVinci Resolve is going to give you a lot of options to really fine-tune the color of your clip. And you don't need to know every single one of these things moving forward. Some of the basics, if you can get the basics in check, you'll know everything you need to know to go ahead and correct your footage and make it look great on YouTube or wherever you're publishing. But I'm going to show you some of these basics so you'll understand the differences when you dive down the rabbit hole. Now, if we're on that original color wheels, remember what we said here? I've got it reset. If I were to left click and hold this wheel and crank up the lows, remember what happens? It's almost like they stuck a pin in the top so that the top doesn't move, and then it grabs the bottom and brings everything up. But watch what happens when I switch over to this other primary wheel, the log wheels, and I'm going to left click and grab the shadow. It's still a similar thing. We're still working with the darkest portions of the color spectrum. But if I just left click and hold that wheel and I move it to the right, can you see what happens? Really narrow band. Can you see how it's really focusing on just the darks? It didn't move everything way up. It was almost like it said, hey, why don't we pin it more in the middle and really focus on just moving just the bottom section, just squash that lowest areas and take some of the darkness out of the red, green, and blues. That's your control on the log wheels. It's really focusing on a much narrower band in that light spectrum from dark to light. It's not moving a lot of stuff in that 384 to 512 range. It's really staying in that, 256 or below. That's what's getting squashed. And when we reset it and go back to the previous color wheels, remember what this did? It moved everything all the way up to the very top. We were just seeing the top pinned. So what you want to think about is when you're working with these different wheels, what part of your footage needs correcting? Do you need to make major adjustments that affect a lot of the footage? Or maybe it's just something in the reds and the very highlights of it that might be overwhelming. So when picking which one of the wheels you want to work with, there's really only two choices here: your color wheels or your log wheels, because the color bars are just another iteration of the very first one, the color wheels, with more fine tuning. So color wheels for fairly broad motions, color bars, broad motions, but a little more fine tuning. And then at the end, we have log wheels, which is going to really focus on the light bands and move those only. A lot of people I've seen teach about how to use this color section in the color page. They'll grab that center dot, let's say in the mids, and say, okay, this is a kind of a red footage and I want to make it more blue. And they'll grab that center dot and they'll just start moving it around. That's okay. I think that's a perfectly fine way to work. For me, I got to be honest, it's a little confusing. If I'm looking at the mids and I'm looking at the scope and I say, well, the green mids are a little squashed, whether I want them that way or not, why don't I just go to the mid section, the gamma, that I know has a big wide swath of movement because I'm using the color wheels, which will affect a little bit of the darks and the lights. And let me grab the green in the mids and let me stretch it. Can you see what's happening? It starts bringing the center of those mids up and adjust everything else around it a little bit. It's doing the same thing as moving the center dot, and you'll actually see the center dot move, but I'm doing it in the way that my brain can understand. If I'm looking at this originally and I go, well, I can see all of this red seems to be throatier in the middle. There's a lot more color of red in the middle. There's a lot less color of blue on the highs, and there's sort of in between on the greens. Now, that doesn't mean that that's right or wrong. It just allows me to understand what's on film, what the software is seeing when it's looking at my footage. Let's try to figure out a real basic color correction. Let's start there. Here's a few things I can see. I think that this might be a little dark, so maybe I can open up the very top, right? I can bring it a little brighter. And if you look at the peaks on the red, the green, and the blue, there is a little room to move up. It's like there is some brighter top end that could go up. So maybe you'll come over to the gain, because that's the high end. I'll grab that entire wheel that will move all three, red, green, and blue, and slide it to the right and open up the top. Right about there. I don't want to go way past it. I don't want to flood it. I really don't want to go much past that 1023 line. And I don't always have to hit that either. It's really the look you're going for. But I'm going to start right now and say, let me bring it up to, somewhere near the top of what's visible. It still feels dark. How do I make it less dark? Do I bring the dark up? If I bring the dark up, it definitely gets a little lighter, but it almost looks underexposed. Can you see? It gets lighter, but it doesn't have any of those deep, rich shadows that I like. So bringing all those lift or the shadow tones up is probably not what I want to do. So let me bring those down. Let me make sure that the low end is tapping right on that 0 line. But let me now grab the mids. And this sometimes can be counterintuitive. You go, well, if it's not bright enough, don't I need to turn up the highs? A lot of times it's in the mid-range, the ambient light that really starts making all the different things in there be a little brighter in the mids without blinding your eyes. So let me grab just the mid section, and I'm going to grab that wheel, left click and hold, and I'm going to stretch that middle. I'm using it this way because remember when I use the color wheels, it'll bring a little bit of the lows and move up a little bit of the highs, so it's a nice even curve. It's not just a harsh middle change on a narrow band. I want to bring the whole thing up and make it feel natural, as if there's a light that brought out some of the mid-range, some of the things that were happening in the shot that maybe aren't quite as visible. But as I see that mid come up, it's also stretched some of the bottom. So maybe I want to grab that lower section, the lift, and drop it just a touch, bring some of the darks back. And I'm looking here and I'm saying, okay, now I'm starting to feel what's going on. It's stretched a little bit. It's not quite as dark. It looks a little better to me. I can see more of what's going on, but it is a very sort of red looking shot. That's okay, but I might want to try testing out and seeing where I can adjust that red. If I look at the reds, a lot of it's happening in this mid-range. Can you see? It's spiking way up here, so maybe I want to grab that narrow band across the middle, which would be our gamma, right? Low, middle, high, and then the master. And let me grab the reds from the middle, and let me just dial them back a little bit. Can you see what's happening when I do that? The color just gets a little more balanced. I don't need to go all the way to this like even line where they all need to be even, because you can see now the footage looks way too green. Using your eyes and making sure you're understanding what you're seeing is the most important thing, is really something you want to pay attention to when you're doing any kind of color correcting or color grading. I really just want to get that from where it was, which was really, really red, to a little more neutral. So I'll pull some of that red out of the middle. And I like this much better. Now, if I click on that second section, which is exactly the same, but I haven't done any kind of color correction or color grading, you'll see what the original color looked like. Kind of dark, kind of orange, kind of red. When I go to the new one, suddenly things look a little smoother and they look a little more natural. Now, if you don't always have two clips in your timeline to do that kind of reference point, right up in the upper right above your preview window, you will see there is an option to bypass any of the color changes you've made. So if you've got that clip selected and you just want to see what the changes are from where it was and what you did, just turn the correction off and you'll see it go back and forth and go, ah, now I can compare. But you can also see how the color is a little more balanced now. We've started bringing a little more of the mids back into it. It's not quite as dark and murky. Some of the reds aren't really overwhelming the way they are because we had very little green and even much less blue. The blue's been expanded a bit. It's a little more balanced and I like the look of it. But maybe I don't love the contrast. This is where you can go and use all of these separate icons that are above your wheels and your primaries and below. You'll see there's temperature, tint, contrast, pivot, mid detail, and then down below you'll see color boost, shadows, highlights, saturation, hue, and the luminous mix. Now these change depending on which thing you might pull up, because if you go to the log wheels, it changes to range and pivot. But for right now, I tend to use a lot of the ones right in the primary color wheels options. If I feel that it could use a little more contrast, I'll grab that contrast area, put my mouse in there, left click and drag to the right. Right is up, left is down, and I'll go maybe a little more contrast. That looks pretty good. See how I just gave it a little more contrast from where it was? If I undo that, you'll see it was a little washed out looking. Let me just bring it back up again, a little more contrast. It just starts bringing a little more of the dark tones back in. And if you look at your scopes, you can see that contrast happening. It's stretching out that section and letting the mids go a little deeper into the darks and a little bit up into the higher, brighter tones. You can actually see through the scopes things like contrast in action. what that does to the red, greens, and blues across the lows, the mids, and the highs of the light spectrum. And that contrast, having stretched it, actually made that fill out the color spectrum a bit. So it looks a little better, and it looks a little better on the scopes to me too. Now I might decide that I want either more color or less color, so there are things like the color boost. I could push the color boost up, and you will see that it starts to pivot some of the colors in there. Or I can even just take the entire saturation up and push some of the amount of saturation of each color. I think the color is actually not too bad. The one thing I wouldn't mind seeing is a little bit more of the blue on the turquoise of the drum that he's leaning on. He's leaning on a snare drum. So one of the things I can think about is, wow, that mid-tone, I don't want to get all the blues to go up. I don't want to just grab blues way up on the very high offset and turn all the blues up. Right in that mid-range, it'd be nice to see a little more of that blue so the snare kind of pops a bit more. So I can do that by just going to the gamma, that's our mid-range, grabbing just the blue tone, left-clicking and holding, and dragging it to the right, and it'll stretch that blue. And if you notice, it just starts bringing a little more of the blue out of this snare and a little bit of the blue that's around that record mosaic on the wall, and just makes that blue pop a little more. And you saw it stretch over here on the right in my scopes. You could see that get a little narrower and a little taller, just pulling it a little more to pop a little more blue into it. So all I'm doing is using these scopes to dial in what my eye is seeing. And if I want to check what I've done for changes against the original, as always, just go up to the bypass color, turn it off, and then you can compare the original. And here's the changes we've made. Brighter, more open, some of the blues popping more. The room's a little bit better now. You can see a little bit more of what's going on. And you can see that in the scopes, we've made those adjustments. So what I want you to think about is using these sections over here along with the parade scope to just finding the reds, the greens, and the blues and deciding where they might need a little boost or a little cut. Use your eye, use some of the scopes to see what's going on in here to get the color balanced right within that light spectrum. And that's a great place to start to understand balancing your color. Now, there's a lot more that we can do with the color page here in DaVinci Resolve, but I want you to play with those three primary wheels. You don't even have to be color correcting to make it perfect. Just move things around and watch how your images change color and how it's affecting the look of the footage that you filmed. When you get that down, let me know and we'll move on to some more advanced stuff here in the color page. If you have any questions about anything I've talked about in this section, let me know down below. I'm happy to answer those questions. You guys can do this. Get out there and do some more editing. Peace.